I do wish that we could be together physically, but this is the next best thing. And I really appreciate you all taking time out, especially, yes, on our first warm Sunday in as long as I can remember, it feels like. So thank you for taking the time to be here today. I am very excited to get the chance to talk with you a little bit about the book. So I'm going to talk for a short amount of time, and then we'll have some conversation after, if I understand correctly. Yes. Okay, great. So yeah, so this book came out last fall, and when I started working on it a few years ago, I had no idea just how much of life I would be living online when the book came out into the world. Um, but I want to start by just sharing a little bit about sort of why I wrote this book and how it came into being. So back in 2016, I was working as a humanist community builder at Yale, and in sort of quick succession, a number of really sort of big life-changing events happened for me. The long-term relationship I was in ended. The position I was working in at Yale ended. I ended up moving back to Minnesota, my home state, after almost a decade living out on the East Coast, far away from the rest of my family who all stayed here. And so I was going through this period of sort of immense personal change. And yet I found that I was posting online largely as if it was sort of business as usual. I was, personally having more of a difficult time. There was a lot that I was processing, but online, to anyone who observed my social media output, it would sort of seem as if things were still just kind of going pretty well. And I started to feel this tension between my digital output and the sort of rest of my life. And anytime I feel a kind of split or a tension, that's always the place that I like want to dig into and understand what's going on there. And part of why I think that tension felt so acute is that the internet has been such a large part of my life, both personally and professionally. I built my career as a writer online. I started a blog that ended up connecting with an audience, and that was how I've ended up having the opportunities I've had to write and to speak in media. And then on a personal level, the internet has been a huge part of how I've found community, friendships. The very first people I ever came out to as queer were strangers on internet forums when I was a closeted adolescent. And so it's not as if this tension was sort of a no big deal, because the internet is, by the time I was I was sort of going through these large changes, the internet was not this kind of activity that I would step into and out of like it was when I was a kid biking to the public library to log on to the shared computer for a 20-minute window before it was someone else's turn, and then going back to the rest of my life, which is sort of where the phrase "in real life" originated from, as a way to distinguish between this activity of logging on and the kind of rest of our lives. But by the time I started to notice this tension in my life, it also became really clear to me that the internet wasn't sort of separate from the rest of my life. It was a huge part of how I showed up in the world, how I found a sense of connection. And so, if I felt like there was this tension, then it felt important to understand that. So that was the sort of personal piece. And then the professional piece is that I've been working for the last decade with people who have sort of stepped out of religious institutions, but are still wrestling with questions of meaning and identity and belonging. And I started to notice anecdotally that a lot of these people were turning to the internet to meet a lot of the needs that have historically been met in religious spaces. The need for a sense of meaning and purpose in life, the need for a sense of identity and of place and of community. And then, a few years ago, I started working with a group of sociologists at the University of Minnesota and UMass Boston to study the religiously unaffiliated. And sure enough, we found that is very much the case, that a lot of people, And there's this sort of larger cultural shift happening right now where people are stepping out of religious institutions. That's the sort of fastest growing segment of the religious landscape, is people who say that they're not religious. But people are also sort of just moving out of institutions more broadly. They're leaving political institutions, civic institutions, and instead they're turning to the internet to understand the world around them, to get plugged in and connected. And so I had this sort of personal curiosity, but then for professional reasons, I also really wanted to understand how this shift out of these sort of institutions and into turning to the internet to understand who we are, how that shift is sort of affecting that understanding of what it means to be human. And so I spent the last few years really exploring that question. And I tried to look in, I did a lot of reading about the internet, about how the internet impacts our habits, our behaviors, but I also wanted to look in some more unexpected places. So, for example, I spent a lot of time at the University of Minnesota's map library, interviewing the head of the map library, reading a ton about maps, digging into their archives. And part of what I wanted to understand was how cartographers take this complex three-dimensional terrain and create a representation of it. So how do they take this, incredibly complicated physical space and represent it on a two-dimensional, piece of paper? And that process is a process of curation and selection, right? They have to choose what they're showing on the map and what they're not showing, because if they included every detail, the map would have to be the size of the territory they're documenting itself. And I started reading up about maps because I started to feel as if, we sort of enter into a similar kind of process when sharing our lives online. We choose what we show and what we don't show. And so that was kind of the initial parallel I had in mind. But as I started digging into the archives at the University of Minnesota's map library and reading a lot about maps, and especially after I started talking with the Mapping Prejudice Project at the University of Minnesota, which is a community-based effort to map racial covenants that were put in deeds of houses in Minneapolis, saying only white people could live at these properties, which is a big part of why various neighborhoods in Minneapolis have the racial demographics they have today. I started to realize that these choices that we make aren't neutral choices, right? What we choose to share and how we share ourselves online aren't just sort of whatever whims we may have. They're deeply influenced by the norms and conventions of the platforms themselves, just as what is shown in a map is shaped by the norms and conventions of cartography, which are influenced by who's paying for the maps, who's commissioning the maps. It tends to be people in positions of power, and the maps tend to reflect their view of the world. Likewise, as we sort of share and construct ourselves online, we're doing so through platforms that have all kinds of norms that guide our behavior about what we think is worth showing and sharing, what makes us worthy, what makes us real. And so, that I found that as I started looking in maybe more unexpected places, I found really helpful ways for me to better understand the impact that moving a lot of this work of how we understand who we are to digital space is having on the way I understand myself and other people. So there are a lot of sort of things that I learned through that process that are detailed in IRL. And I obviously can't get into all of them right now, especially knowing that we have a short amount of time, but there are just a couple little things that I want to share that I think were some key takeaways for me. One of them is that, as I mentioned, when I started this process, I was feeling really split between my online and offline lives. And when it comes to sort of commentary on the internet, it largely falls into two categories: the sort of apocalyptics and the utopians. So the people who say that the internet is making us more divided, more narcissistic, more anxious, all these ways that the internet and social media are sort of negatively influencing us. And that's a view that we hear quite a lot. And then there's the sort of utopians who say, no, the internet has the potential to make us more connected than ever, to help us see ourselves as a part of a greater whole, to be more efficient, all these sort of positive things. And then sort of in the middle, there are the kind of utilitarians who say, the internet's here, it's not going anywhere. If anything, more and more of our lives are going to be lived online as we move forward. And so we need to find a way to sort of use it well. And I think when I started working on the book, I was feeling more apocalyptic. I was feeling more like the internet makes me feel less human, not more. And as I started doing all of this research, all of these interviews that I did with people, I found myself moving more toward the middle. I found myself saying, you know, sort of on balance, the internet has it, you know, we've experienced a great amount of change in this sort of transition from a pre-digital age to a digital one. And in that transition, there are things we've lost. There are also things that we've gained. And, you know, my goal is to sort of make the best of this new reality. But by the end of this process, I came to sort of feel, I think that's still true of me, but I came to feel something else, which is that I actually think that this living in this moment of transition gives us a really valuable opportunity, because anytime we go through some really huge transition like this, it kind of forces us to ask ourselves certain kinds of questions that we don't have to ask when we're not trying to do something new. So one thing I think that this sort of shift to a more digital life offers us is that it makes us amateurs. It makes us, we're doing something that we're really, really bad at. So I thought, as I was thinking about this, I thought about how when I was entering high school, my mom said I had to go out for a team sport. And growing up, I was not at all athletic. I was very bookish. And my siblings were all very athletic. So that family rule totally made sense for them. Did not make sense for me. So I protested, but my mom was insistent. So I went out for cross country because I was a terrible runner and an even worse endurance runner. And so I figured, okay, in an attempt at self-sabotage here, I'm just going to go out for the thing I'm like the worst at. But it truly was self-sabotage in the sense that I didn't know that everybody who tries out for cross country makes the cross country team, no matter how bad they are. So I ended up making the team, and I was furious, but I was stuck. I had to do it. And so, but over the course of the season, I found that I was kind of getting better as I kept doing it. And by the end of the year, I got the most improved award, which sounds impressive, except it really just says how bad I was when I started. It's not as if I was suddenly winning races. But anyway, I got most improved. I got most improved again the next year, because again, I was really, really bad when I started. But I learned two things from being on the cross country team. The first is that actually I really enjoyed running. I was surprised that this thing that I thought I wouldn't ever like was something that I enjoyed, and I still do to this day. But I also learned that you discover fundamentally different things about yourself when you do something that you're not good at. Prior to that, I had really stuck to the kind of activities and hobbies that I kind of naturally excelled at, things that I was, you know, drawn to, that I was good at. And I learned that you actually discover really important things about yourself when you do something that you're not good at yet. And I think online, we're all trying to sort of be human in a space where none of us are good at it yet. We don't really know what we're doing. We're figuring it out as we go. And so these frequently inelegant attempts at being ourselves online, I think, give us a chance to discover things about ourselves. So I don't think it's just that the internet is here, it's not going anywhere, and we have to figure out how to live well online. I think it's also that this shift gives us a chance to discover things about ourselves and about what it means to be human. It's a chance to kind of go back to the drawing board a little bit and ask ourselves, which I think is something we've all experienced over this last year, to say, you know, what do I need in order to feel like myself? And how can I go about getting it in this new format? And I think that, you know, if we expect life online to exactly replicate the kinds of experiences we can have offline, we will feel like something is off. We'll feel dissatisfied by that. And I think, again, that's something we experienced very early in the pandemic. It was like, okay, how can we just very quickly recreate these offline experiences, whether it's online gathering as a community or whether it's online school, how can we sort of recreate it? And of course, that's not going to feel the same. But I think if we instead say, what are the particular sort of offerings that that digital life has that perhaps enable us to do things we couldn't do offline, then I think we have a chance to harness it for its ability to transform us. Anytime there is a sort of immense technological shift, it's a scary, difficult time. In times of great change, there is loss. I mean, I think about when we experienced this cultural shift to when the printing press was introduced. Initially it was who had access to the printing press, people in positions of power, and those were the and likewise we see that sort of play out in the sort of digital realm that we have right now, which is we tend to think of the internet as public space, but it's really not. It's private space. It's funded by private corporations who ultimately have their own interests at heart, not our own. And yet, and there is loss, right? Like, I think we all feel the loss of not being able to gather in person. And likewise, when the printing press was introduced, for as much as it helped, spread information in ways that could never have been possible before, there was loss when knowledge is transferred. Like, so oral traditions declined as a result of the introduction of the printing press, and when knowledge and information is transferred person to person, that fosters certain kinds of relationships that are lost when you're reading a book. We all love reading books. I love writing them. Books are great, but it's different, right? And so, I think we all feel those losses, but we have an opportunity to ask ourselves, what have we lost, and how can we go about sort of meeting those needs in this new space? And that's where I think, again, there's so much more I could say, so much more I'd love to say, but I also want to make sure we have plenty of time for conversation. And so I think the last thing I want to share is I teach in a department of religion and philosophy now at a Lutheran university, and I'm not Lutheran, but I am surrounded by them both at work and also just in general, living in Minnesota. and so I can't help but be influenced by the water around me. And the chair of our department is a scholar of the works of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I'm sure most of you are familiar, but if you're not, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German theologian, and he was living at the time of the rise of the Nazis. And Bonhoeffer believed that Christians have a responsibility to live as if there isn't a God. And what he meant by that is that Christians should work to discern the will of God and then act on God's behalf in the world. And for him, that meant taking that idea seriously meant that he ultimately participated in an attempt to assassinate Hitler, and that's why he was imprisoned ultimately. So pretty cool guy. But I found myself thinking about this idea a lot as I spent these years exploring life online and what it means to be real, what it means to be human in digital space. And by the end of the book, I didn't believe that I could, nor did I even attempt to sort of resolve the debate around whether or not life online is truly as real as the rest of our lives. So just spoiler alert, if you pick up the book, I don't think that idea is, that question is sort of put to rest by it. But I do think that whatever you think of life online, as real as life offline, more real, less real, I think that we would do ourselves a great service if we treat life online as if it is as real as the rest of our lives, that we see it as being just as consequential, just as ripe with possibility, that as having just as many opportunities to teach us things about ourselves and one another as the rest of our lives. Because I think we do ourselves a huge disservice when we think, even sort of subconsciously, of life online as being somehow less real than the rest of our lives, as not being real life, because we sort of cleave off this increasingly large part of our lives as not having the potential to reveal us to ourselves, to teach us things about ourselves and one another. And when I look at in some ways it can become an easy way to dismiss things about yourself. You know, if I am rude to somebody on Facebook, for example, who says something snarky in response to something I post, and I sort of fire off an equally snarky response, if I think of my life online as being less real than the rest of my life, it's not really counting in the same way, then it's easy for me to sort of justify those actions, to say like, well, it doesn't really count. It's not real. Rather than saying, you know, well, what does that tell me about myself, that was my response to that person? In what ways is or isn't that consistent with the values I'm trying to live out in the world? And so, you know, I think we not only sort of either intentionally or unintentionally absolve ourselves of trying to sort of bring the same values we try to practice in the other parts of our lives to the internet, when we tell ourselves it doesn't count, it's not as real, it's not as consequential. But we also deny ourselves the opportunity to see ourselves in our online actions, to see what the internet reveals to us about ourselves, to see what we can learn from the sort of, again, frequently inelegant attempts to be human online that we engage in. And I think that, you know, I think that's a loss. I think because the internet is increasingly a space that we turn to meet really important needs, the need for meaning, the need for connection, community, it's also a space that we should take seriously, that we should treat as consequential. And that doesn't mean that we still don't need experiences offline. And that was, you know, one of the sort of, near the end of working on IRL, I took a 3-month social media break, mostly just so I could focus on finishing the book, but also so I could get some time offline for some perspective. And what I found was, initially I was going through huge withdrawal. My friends were like, "You're texting us in tweet format." But then that sort of withdrawal faded, and then I felt immense relief. I found myself feeling way less anxious, way more at ease, which would seem to sort of confirm this idea that more time online makes you more anxious, you know, lonelier, etc. But I realized that it was basically akin to being on a meditation retreat. I mean, if that's your thing, I'm not really, I've tried meditation many times. It's not really my thing, but it's like being off on a retreat or a vacation. You know, of course you feel more relaxed, more at ease, less anxious, because you're disconnected from the world. You're not confronted by other people's realities. You're not forced to see in yourself the ways that you sometimes treat other people. And so, of course, going offline might make you less anxious. But just as Thomas Merton initially considered sort of becoming a kind of hermit, and then eventually realized that the value of going off on retreat was that it gives you perspective that then brings you back into the world. I think that it's important to have time offline, disconnected, so that you can have perspective that then brings you back into connection with others. And not, you know, I don't think the value of taking time away from the internet is that life online isn't as real or doesn't count, but rather because we need the kind of perspective we can only get in times of solitude, times when we're alone, that then brings us sort of back into the world. And so whether it's online or offline, I think we should treat our lives and the ways that we show up in the world seriously, and see them as giving us opportunities to learn new things about ourselves, even when it's something as silly as a Facebook status update. So I'll leave it at that, but I really look forward to your questions and some conversation. So thanks for having me.